What happens when the very place that's supposed to keep you safe becomes a source of illness and heartbreak? For Andrea Hembroff, that question wasn't hypothetical. Her journey into the mold industry didn't start with a textbook, training, or even a career plan. It started inside her own home when toxic mold exposure began to silently unravel her family's health. Like so many others, Andi and her loved ones experienced the confusion, frustration, and fear that comes with living in a moldy environment. Doctors couldn't always connect the dots. Friends and neighbors didn't always understand, and the stigma surrounding mold illness made the struggle even heavier. What should have been a refuge quickly turned into a battleground for their health and well-being. But instead of letting that experience define her family, Andi chose to transform it. She took her pain and turned it into purpose, becoming an advocate, an educator, and eventually a professional in the mold industry. She's found her passion in the indoor sciences, helping families, indoor environmental professionals, and health practitioners uncover the dangers of mold and mycotoxins. Her passion now is to make sure that families aren't left in the dark and to educate others so they don't have to go through the same struggles alone. This episode of The Mold Show isn't just about science or even just about mold. It's about resilience, it's about advocacy, and it's about hope when it feels like none exists. So settle in and join us for a powerful conversation with Andrea Hembroff, mold advocate, educator, lab consultant, as she shares her journey from personal struggle to professional mission.
Andi, thank you for joining the Mold Show. We've been chatting it up a little bit, and I sincerely, I'm thankful that you decided to jump on with me and Sean. And Andi, we just want to kind of learn your story. You know, kind of what brought you to us. What's your mold journey been like?
Thanks for having me on, you guys. I love your podcast. I love your platform. Really good information. So thanks for the opportunity.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you for coming on. I'm glad you reached out to us, Andi, because we've said this before, but one of our goals of this podcast is to create a sense of community. And the only way we can do that is having people share their stories. So yeah, without further ado, why don't you just jump right into it for us?
Well, I never intended to be in the mold industry. It's certainly not glamorous or exciting, but I found my way into the industry out of necessity. And my story starts in 2017. My husband and I were renting a home in Minneapolis, and our 2-year-old daughter contracted lead poisoning from our rental home. And so we caught it right away, and we weren't ready to buy a house, but we qualified for just enough. And my mom's been a realtor, 40, 50 years and helped us find a house. So we found a house in our budget, had a pre-purchase inspection. There was no red flags. And, I was pretty excited to own a home. And we moved in. We moved into the house October of 2017. 2 months after we moved in, our dog died. She was a 5-year-old. She was 5 years old, totally healthy, and she developed a really sudden neurological disorder. So we had to put her down right before Christmas. It was a sad day. Pretty suddenly, my health started to change, but I had just had my third baby, and, there was a lot going on with my body. So I chalked it up to, well, I'm getting older. We moved into this house, this is postpartum, all of the things, right? So it started as ringing in my ears that was kind of intermittent, migraines, which wasn't typical for me if I wasn't pregnant. So again, I chalked it up to postpartum. And then anxiety that was not typical of me. And I'm usually pretty fearless, and it was just weird, uncontrollable anxiety. So, and I remember one point, I'm not a fan of going to the doctor, and, my husband was like, oh, you should just go to the doctor. I'm like, well, for what? Do I go for this symptom or that symptom? I'm like, it's, and at the time I had no idea they were all interconnected.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's funny how mold almost uses the stress on our body for whatever we're going through to kind of hide behind, if
Yeah.
you will. We always chalk it up to something else, the stress. Like you
Yep.
said, I'm getting older. I'm going through this. I'm going through that. It loves to hide behind that curtain.
Yeah, I mean, toxic exposure and toxic illnesses are like that. It's like the boiling frog analogy, where the water's cold and then it gets a little warmer and it gets a little warmer and all of a sudden it's boiling, and that's kind of how it was. It was like, okay, I'm unwell, and then it was kind of like, okay, something's really wrong, and I started. I was pre-med. That was my education was in the sciences. I wanted to practice medicine one day. And so, I was well read, and I started reading. I was like, well, this is very autoimmune like. So I started going down that path. The end of 2019, beginning of 2020, I was diagnosed with late stage Lyme disease and co-infections. And that made sense to me. I live in Minnesota. I am an avid outdoors woman. Ironically, I'm a mycology enthusiast. So I'm always out in the woods looking for mushrooms, still am today. So Lyme disease made sense to me. I started treating out of pocket, which was expensive, treated for a year. It was crazy expensive, and I never improved. And during this time too, I got to the point where I was so sick I couldn't work. So at my worst, I had dementia-like symptoms. I couldn't remember my kids' names. There was one day I looked at my oldest son and I thought he was my baby brother. I couldn't find my words. And, I would be like, what did we do last night? Did I talk to my husband today? Just really weird stuff. I'd come out of the grocery store and I couldn't find the truck, and I'd be like, oh my God, I got stolen. And then I'd have like these seizure-like episodes, just like these really, really bizarre things. So I was unable to work. So here we're paying out-of-pocket medical expenses, and I'm not able to work. And I remember at one point, somebody reached out to me on Facebook in a Lyme group and was like, well, you're not healing from Lyme because you're living in mold. And I'm like, no, I'm not. I mean, literally, she kept at it. She's like, you're living in mold. I'm like, no, I'm not. My mom sold me this house. I keep a meticulously clean house as much as I can with 3 kids. And I was just like, there's no mold in here. And then, and then I was like, okay, yeah, there's a little bit of mold in the basement, but it's Minnesota. And I brought it to my doctor. I said, I think I'm living in mold. And he's like, oh, we'll address that later. Well, later never came because we were out of money. So I traveled out of state, and my best friend was getting married. I was a maid of honor. I was super sick, and I returned home. And I remember I came home, and within 10 minutes of being in my home, I said to my husband, I said, it's the house, it's mold. And we were just kind of like, shoot, because we were tapped out. We had no money, one income. So by the time we figured out it was mold, we didn't have anywhere to go. We didn't have any money. And so we moved out to a tent, and we lived in a tent with our 2 dogs, the kids, during like a 90-degree summer. I don't recommend that, by the way. It was not it's not a
Wow.
good time. So
You said you were an outdoor enthusiast.
I am.
Yeah.
And the kids were really little. I'll be really candid with you and tell you that I was suffering so much that I didn't want to be here. And so very quietly, I went and I rewrote my life insurance policy. I tripled the coverage. And then I had a plan. I read the fine print. I knew when it would pay out 100% no matter what. And so I had a plan. And part of it was I was suffering, but also like I knew how toxic this house was. And my kids they were really little at the time. And I wanted my kids out. And my husband, I have the best husband in the world, and he was just like, okay, all right, we got to live in a tent in 90-degree weather. Cool. Okay. But put strain on things. And at one point he was like, just go. If you can't be here, just go. I'm like, I'm not leaving my children here. So when I was in the tent, and so I was writing letters and kind of preparing for that, but also I don't take that lightly. I mean, I love my husband, I love my kids. And so I started reading, and it was really tough at first because I very legitimately had dementia-like symptoms. So I'd read like the first sentence of a book 20 times over again, but that was my path. Like I couldn't afford to hire the professionals.
Right.
So I had to be the professional. I reached out to, do you guys know who Michael Pinto is with Wonder Makers Environmental?
I do, yes.
Yeah, he's an educator and an author in the industry. I wrote him an email one night at 2 a.m. He responded like 9 hours later. He sent me a free textbook, Fungal Contamination. I read that sucker from cover to cover. I read everything on indoor air quality, mold remediation, healing from mold toxicity, environmental testing, like you name it, I read it. And really quickly, I discovered like, holy crap, this industry is really unregulated. The professionals that I had hired didn't know what a mycotoxin was. It was pretty alarming. So at first I started to advocate for myself and my family. And then I got better because we remediated and I was outside. And then I forced my way into the industry. I knew that this is what I wanted to do. Chased down a company that was local to me. The poor owner, I chased him for 3 months. I'm like, if you don't hire me, I'm going to show up at your doorstep. And his exact words were like, you're kind of weird, but you're smart. So he did. He hired me after 3 months, making pennies. He was like, here's a desk. I have no idea what I'm going to do with you, but here's a desk. So what I did in his business, he did inspections and remediation, is I created my own role in the company. He kind of gave me free range. And so it was that of an advocate and an educator. And I formed relationships with our team and functional medicine doctors. And so it was great. I was in the industry for 3 years. I started to make a name for myself, learn really a lot. And then I got sick again. And this was probably a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, I started to decline again. And same thing. I was like, well, is this perimenopause? Am I doing too much? Is it Lyme again? And so I traveled. I've gotten really good about being cognizant of how I feel in different environments, which I encourage everybody to do that, by the way. I don't care if you're hypersensitive or not. Pay attention. Take inventory of your mental health, anything and everything when you're in different environments, and get in the habit of that.
It's funny you mentioned that, Andi, because that's something that the owner of our company at Certified Mold Assessments, Al, I don't know if there's ever a conversation where he doesn't ask that question. And a lot of times people don't think much of it. No, I don't think so. I feel pretty much the same everywhere.
Uh-huh.
And then here comes that 1 week family vacation. And sure enough, they feel like a totally different person.
Right.
And then we get that phone call on the back end. Okay, yeah, I think I do feel a lot better when I'm not in the house.
There's a lot of caveats to that. And so thank you for mentioning that. Like if you would have asked me that during this, I would have been like, I feel like crap everywhere.
Everywhere. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have to, like when I'm, playing mold detective, I have to have some semblance of wellness, and also when I'm well, if I have a mold exposure, I actually feel worse when I'm detoxing after the mold exposure. And it's because when you're detoxing from biotoxins, it's kind of like kicking a rowdy guy out of a bar. And on the way out, he's going to kick over tables and chairs. So you're going to feel worse before you feel better. And that's important for people to understand, because they're like, well, we remediated our house and we should feel better, or we moved and we should it doesn't work like that. It's not that simple, but I've gotten very good at it, and I've taught my kids to be good at it. So I went away. I visited a friend, my best friend again, and I know her house is solid and safe. Came home, felt good, went to bed. Sure enough, my symptoms came back. And my husband at this point believes me. I mean, I could tell him like, hey, we need to burn down the house. He'd be like, cool, where's the gas and match? Maybe I shouldn't say that. But he trusts me. And so we started sleeping in a room across the hall. I felt better. Then we started sleeping in the camper and I felt better. And the longer that I was out of that space, the more sure I was that there was an issue in that room. And it's weird. It's kind of like flipping a switch. So once we were out of that room for a few weeks, I couldn't be in there for more than 5 minutes. And that's very real. And I do understand there's psychosomatic effects. I'm not naive to that, but it was very real. I'd go into that room, my ears would ring, I would feel foggy and just unwell. So during this time, I was in the industry. I want to make this really clear. I was in the industry. I had access to more professionals and tools than most people. I had multiple very capable inspectors through that space. They used all the tools: thermal imaging, moisture meters, particle counters, borescope cameras. Didn't find anything. We did spore trap sampling. That didn't show anything. That's not so abnormal. We did wall cavity sampling. That didn't show anything. I even got to test a new dust test that was on before it even hit the market that was looking at mycotoxins. That didn't show anything, which was wild because that room was super dusty because it had sat vacant. But I was really persistent, and I was working with my boss. At the time, I was like, "Boss, I know there's something going on in here," and he had access to this mycotoxin air test, and so we ran that. It's called a MIA, Airborne Mycotoxin Environmental Analysis. It came back off the charts with ochratoxin A, trichlothicines, and aflatoxin. They all came back detectable and super high. So we took out a second mortgage with an interest rate that literally made me throw up. We did exploratory remediation, and we weren't messing around. We remediated from the outside in to the inside out, resided the house, found mold behind the siding near my bedroom, nowhere else, thanks to a woodpecker. Once the siding was off, we discovered the windows on that side of the house were not flashed and super moldy. Also found a super, super, super moldy subfloor in the master bathroom. We demoed the whole bedroom, the whole bathroom, and resided the house. Found it, thank God, because I think I'd probably be single if there wasn't anything there, because it was a second mortgage. But we knew what mold did to me, and I was so close to being bedbound. So, learned pretty quick the limitations of a non-invasive inspection. But so we have the house put back together, and then I started chasing that company, Respirare Labs. I chased them for a year. I was pretty excited about their technology. Saved my life, and they hired me after a year. So now that's where I've landed. And
so worked twice for you, that approach. It sounds like.
I'm telling you, it's.
Well, not only are you persistent in your professional life, obviously persistent in figuring out and finding the problem. I mean, you made it very clear. Your body was telling you something when you were in that space, and results be damned. You weren't willing to. You knew that there had to be a source issue there. I was hoping you would tell me, that you found growth, not because I wanted there to be some there, but because, oftentimes, like you said, there are layers to buildings. You don't know where necessarily you're going to find things until you start to do the evasive exploratory and ultimately remediate like you did. So
yeah, and that shows me that you're in this industry and that when I worked for my last boss and I would set inspections, and I would often pray over his clients, and a lot of times I would pray that they found mold because it's tangible.
Yeah.
Lyme disease, that's a mixed bag, but mold is so tangible. And when we started looking at mold, I was like, all right, well, this makes sense. The other thing is there's such a stigma with mold toxicity, and people say to me all the time, like, don't you get sick about talking about mold all the time? For sure. Had I battled breast cancer, super tough, I would have wanted to get past that and never talk about it again. But the problem with mold toxicity and Lyme disease is that they're so stigmatized, and people are like, it's weird. Mold is kind of a trigger for people, and it's frustrating that it's so stigmatized and also controversial because it's so tangible. One thing that I really, if I could go back to school and do anything, but I'm in my 40s, so that's not a possibility. But I go back and study neuroscience. My brain was really affected. I never had any respiratory illnesses. By the way, we found very high levels of airborne aflatoxin in my home. If I know you guys know this, aflatoxin is one of the most known potent carcinogens known to man. If you even Google it, even Google will tell you that, and it's related to liver and lung cancer. That's actually what the previous homeowner died of. That's why the seller sold the house. His wife was diagnosed with liver and lung cancer in January. She was dead by June. We bought the house in October.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. We actually just recently did a breakdown of that update from the National Institute of Health, which added a lot of this stuff, and how aflatoxin can affect us in so many different ways than what's thought about by the general public. And finally, looking at this seriously and kind of validating what we've all been saying for years.
Yeah, it's wild. And you can't see my home office, but I love books. I love to read. I'm kind of a nerd. I'm a hoot at parties, but when I was diving into this, I am. I'll start lecturing. We'll drinking tequila. But at one point in my journey, I read that mycotoxins were used in biowarfare. So I actually bought a military textbook on biowarfare. I have it on my shelves, and there's a whole chapter on trichothecenes. And the trichothecene that's used in biowarfare is T2, which, by the way, was found in my bedroom. It is one that can cross the blood-brain barrier, and they use it because it's so toxic, And so these people that are like, "Oh, mold doesn't do that. Mold doesn't do that." Well, if we're using it in biowarfare, like really, and the disconnect, it's frustrating because people are like, well, it's in food. It's in food. It absolutely is in our food, hands down. But it's in water damaged buildings too. And that's not junk science. And it's frustrating because I'm a very scientific woman. I'm very pragmatic. And the disconnect is frustrating. And why they're not teaching this in medical school is even more frustrating. I have, in my 4 years being in this industry, I've reached 3 neurologists, and at the time I didn't know they were neurologists. I was working with them on a professional level, shared a little bit of my story, and they're like, wait, neurological mold? And then I explained how, mold can cross the blood-brain barrier. And now they refer a lot of their clients to folks like yourself because they, like, oh, maybe this is a toxic exposure. So, there's a lot of work to do in that vector. And that's my goal is to help break that stigma, but also to connect IEPs like yourself with doctors, because we can't make progress with these environmental illnesses without people like you. You guys are such an important role, in the healing of families like mine. I mean, it's doctors take all the credit, right? We put them on pedestals, like, oh, they know everything. And then we make them idols, but really it's folks like yourself that do some serious healing.
Well, the doctors play a really important role. We're just part of the puzzle, but we do take pride in how much we help families, because we've seen tremendous turnarounds and still talk to a lot of our clients to this day.
Isn't it
If some
wild?
of those clients that we've seen the best turnarounds with.
Yeah.
But what are some things you wish you knew when you were going through your exposure, Andi? And looking back, were there red flags that you thought were odd about your home that you think, now that you know what you know, oh, I should have done something about that?
Oh God, where do I begin? First and foremost, you have to understand the professionals that you hire. You have to understand their limitations. My mom's a very smart woman. She's been a realtor for 50 years. She had no idea what mold could do. It's just not in their continuing education. General contractors, in my last role, I would speak in front of a lot of groups of general contractors. And I remember one time I was like, well, do you guys do bathroom remediations? Oh yeah, all the time. I said, well, do you come across water damaged building material? Yeah. And I said, well, do you set containment and negative air pressure? No. We're going to rip it out anyways. And I said, well, what do you think mold remediation is? They're like, oh, and it's like a light bulb goes off. So you have to really understand HVAC contractors. They know nothing about air quality. It's wild. Mind blown. So
I've only met two. I've been doing this over 10 years. I've only met 2 that even have a clue of how to approach mold.
I've looked high and low. I can't find one that knows anything about air quality, which is wild because the HVAC system is the lungs of the home. So you have to really understand the limitations of your professionals, period. Just because they work on houses doesn't mean that they know everything. I used to roof houses back in my college days. I was a good shingler too. But I didn't know what I was doing. I was laying shingles. And so I would probably never hire a company that subcontracts ever again to do any sort of work. Like when we were doing our siding, I hired a friend that, did the work. He was on site all the time. He knew what I was going through. And he's like, hey, we got to stop work. Your windows are not properly flashed. There's mold. We got to replace all this. Had I hired anybody else, they would have just sided over it. Another lesson that I have learned is when you're navigating mold toxicity and issues in your home, number one, there is no perfect home. Okay, there are definitely situations where it's not worth it. Like I've seen houses with wooden foundations. Like, no thanks, burn it to the ground. But there is no perfect home. And if you're hypersensitive, you're hypersensitive. So at some point, families like mine, we have to choose where we're going to grow our roots and put our resources into making that home the best that it can be. With that said, you have to be cognizant of your resources. And that's the biggest thing is some of these people will be like, well, I hired this company because they're great advocates and they're super well known. And this big doctor recommended them. And they'll pay like 15 grand for an inspection. And then, and then have to remediate. You have to, when you're dealing with environmental illnesses, you have to diagnose your home, you have to heal your home, you have to diagnose your body, you have to heal your body. None of it's covered by homeowners insurance typically, and it's usually not covered by health insurance either. So you have to be really careful about each step of the way and where you're putting your resources. The same goes for like when you go to test your house. I'm a fan of objective-based testing. I'm a fan of following an order of operations. And so you have to be careful there.
And there's no problem with spending that kind of money, but make sure you're choosing a company that's actually going to give you some value and give you some guidance and help you through the process, not just throwing that money into the garbage.
Well, and a lot of times the money spent. Now I want to make this really clear. I'm in the world of environmental testing. That's literally what I sell. So hear me when I say this. It's not always good to over test. More data points is always advantageous. I live in Minnesota. I would love to go down to the Mayo Clinic and run every test, every genetic test, every single test under the sun. But data points cost money. And you have to understand that. And also data points is part of the diagnostic process. And so the biggest mistake I see people make as an advocate and as a consultant is they will spend a ton of money acquiring data points without reaching a solid environmental diagnosis, something that they can work with, right? So when people reach out to me, they're like, Andi, I need to test my house for mold. I ask them a ton of questions before recommending any one test. And you'll be surprised to know that I don't always recommend, Respirare's technology because I try to identify an objective. If you own your home and your goal is to remediate it, your objective in testing it should be to identify sources of moisture, both past and present, and to determine what building material is affected by mold. Water damaged buildings, they were under a whole host of biological contaminants, not just mold and mycotoxins. So You want to start, looking at the whole dang house and look for moisture.
And it takes a while to figure that out.
It does.
A couple hours when you're talking about the history of a 20, 30-year-old home, it doesn't just take a couple hours. I mean, Adam knows this because he's been shadowing a little bit over the last month or so. It takes a long time.
Well, and I have to give it up to you guys because working in this hypersensitive vertical is really difficult. And I think people think because it's a house, it's an inanimate object, like it's so easy to diagnose, and it's not. It's not. You have to take into consideration changing building codes and just a number of factors. And there's always going to be limitations with a non-invasive inspection. Just like in my room, I had one data point that confirmed what I was feeling. And it was because of that one data point that we took out a ridiculous second mortgage and tore the sucker down, and we found it. But am I going to do that to my entire house? Probably not. Mm-hmm. And so you have to, when these people choose a professional to work with, they should approach it like they would with a primary care provider. And hear me out with this. When you go into the doctor and you say, Doc, I don't feel good, your doctor is not going to run an MRI and exploratory surgery. They're going to start, they're going to take your complaints. They're going to look at your medical history. They're going to do a physical exam there. And sometimes they run a basic blood panel. I have Lyme disease and mold toxicity. I'll tell you, I've never gotten a diagnosis after that first visit, right?
Yeah.
Oftentimes I've gone back. They've been, Andi, your labs looked good, and I'm going to send you to this specialist or order this test. So diagnosing a home is much the same. We start holistically. We look at the whole house. We use thermal imaging, moisture meters, particle counters, spore trap air sampling, right? All of those things. And sometimes you don't find it. And so when you're working in this hypersensitive community, I like inspectors that never say, Andi, there is nothing here. There's nothing here. What I like to hear is, we didn't find anything.
Right.
Hey, Andi, I know you're working with this mold literate doctor. If they retest you in a few months and they think you're still being exposed, give me a call back. This is what we can do. And so it's important to build relationships with your indoor environmentalists, because you want to call them back, because they're going to come in and they're going to know the history of your home. They're going to know where to dig deeper, because there's a time and a place. We put our house back together. My sweet husband, God, I love him. He's stuck with me now. And he says, well, after being out of the house for like a year, he's like, well, do you think we got it all? I'm like, no. And it's just me being realistic.
Mm-hmm.
I said, if we tore into that wall, I'm sure we'd find something, but every effort I've made in my home, I've healed. So
Right.
The goal is always to reduce exposure as much as possible so that you can at least make it healthy enough to recover like you have.
Yeah.
Andi,
Mm-hmm.
I've had clients who allowed me to gut the home down to the block and the framing, the trusses. But it's a rare occasion you're going to find somebody who's going to be willing to go to that extreme to make sure that they got it all. And so most remediations end up being targeted remediations based off of a protocol which has information based on limited data points. And it is a starting point often for us. I just did a remediation recently where what seemed to be an isolated situation, after pulling the baseboards off the walls, the drywall off the walls, the furring strips off the walls, this is a block building, and then the foam core insulation off the walls, introduced an extreme a moisture condition issue that you wouldn't have known had you not had the ability to not only start evasively but look further and further to see how far this issue branched out. What you're describing is accurate. This is, whether people want to hear it or not, you really don't know until you're able to or willing to pull back those layers. And most people, like you, are a perfect example. Aren't willing to, or at this point, not sure if it's worth the squeeze to tear apart other pieces of your house just to potentially locate and diagnose a mold problem. So, the other thing I want to mention to you, you talked about earlier, camping out in your front yard. I have had probably 6 or 7 clients that camped either in one room in their house together, the whole family, kids, dogs, cats, husband, wife in one section, or in the RV. What you said, I've seen, I've witnessed personally many, many times. Yeah. And so you're not alone in that either.
No, it was very, very magical. I mean, the kids had fun. I was trying to create a magical experience for my kids, and they look back on it fondly. I tried really hard to mask how scared I was.
Sure.
But I for anybody that's listening to this, because it can be overwhelming, the path forward isn't. It might be different for other people than it is for me, because some people have a supportive spouse, some people don't. Some people have a ton of money, some people don't. And I was told, and this kind of played into my I can't do this. I need to take my life. And so I'm not a fan of people that are like, you have to get rid of everything, because that's what I was told. I was like, well, you'll never get better if you don't replace everything in your house. And I was just like, what? And, and you'll never get well in that house. And I believed that. And then I got well. And by the way, I'm still in this house. My home office was one of the rooms remediated. And so a step forward is a step forward. And so for those people, Adam, that do those targeted remediations, like me, every remediation we've done, I've improved.
Mm-hmm.
And so when this issue came up in our bedroom, by the way, that was always there. And I think that I didn't pick up on it because like our basement was, excuse the term, foobarred. Like it was so bad. The foundation was compromised. There was mold behind every wall. We had to gut the sucker. And of course I improved. So I think the more I healed myself in the house, I became more honed in, if that makes sense. And so for people that are like, well, we don't have the money to do everything, it's just hopeless. It's not. You have to start somewhere. And by the time we got to that, my husband and I knew the effect mold had on me. So the decision to take out the second mortgage, we knew that was the right thing to do.
Yeah.
We didn't blink twice. So for anybody that's listening, don't let anybody tell you it's this way or nothing, because that's not so. There's a lot of paths to get well.
And it just creates such a sense of hopelessness when people put it that way, which can be so stressful, feeling so hopeless. But you just brought up relationship with your spouse. So you kind of opened the door for me to ask this question that we had sent to us over the weekend. And it's a good one because we experience it, I don't want to say on a daily basis, but on a pretty routine basis. And it sounds like you and your husband have a really good relationship. I'm sure it caused quite a bit of tension over what you all have gone through. But the question that was sent to us was, what do you do when your spouse won't listen to you about the mold in your house? Which I'm guessing that means they're having some health issues because of it, if she's sending it our way. But do you have any advice, Andi, given what you all have experienced? And that's where we have to wrap things up this episode with Andi, right as I'm asking the toughest question we hear. We'll be sharing her response in our next episode, so make sure you're subscribed to The Mold Show on your favorite podcast platform. In the meantime, if this conversation struck a chord with you, please share it with someone who might need to hear it. And send us your own questions. They might just make it on the next episode. Thanks for listening to The Mold Show.
The content in this podcast should not be taken as medical advice. While our goal is to educate, the hosts are not medical professionals, and the opinions expressed are their own. For any health concerns or questions about mold exposure and its effects, please seek the advice of a qualified healthcare provider.